Hello, everybody. It's Don Davis, one of your hosts from your favorite podcast, Supply Chain Secrets. In today's show, it's just Brian and I, which is all you need, quite frankly. But it's a departure from previous guest format. And it's just Brian and I talking about TPM and sharing our insights. In today's show, you're going to hear our thoughts about, I think, one of the main premises from the JOC, which is rebuilding relationships and do relationships matter. And I think, spoiler alert, we think the JOC did a great job, but you can listen and hear the reasons why. And then we really got into some takeaways and some different strategies, which I thought was a lot of fun to talk about today. We're talking about how, first of all, the industry is changing. And then secondly, we start to unpack the complexity and the types of solutions that are out there and different ways to think about solutions. Then we get into a little bit on carrier strategies. Are all carriers with the same strategy? Are there different strategies? And how maybe do you want to think about that? Then we started to talk a little bit about the decarbonization of the industry, and there's some impacts there, and I think you'll enjoy listening to that. Then we talked about new technologies and how new technologies are affecting the industry. And then finally, what I think the moment you're all been waiting for is what's going to happen in the future, and is the market going to go up or down? And Brian and I debate either direction and give you some insights and thoughts around what we think is going to happen. So it was a fun show. Had a great time producing it with Brian, and I think you'll like it. So give it a listen and hear what we thought about TPN. So enjoy the show, everybody.
You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Bryan Most and Don Davis.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm Bryan Most, SVP of Retail Strategy at NYSHX and former VP of Supply Chain at Walmart.
And I'm Don Davis. I'm the Senior Vice President of Carrier Strategy here at NYSHX and former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM.
And we're back again with our podcast, Supply Chain Secrets. Well, Don, here we are, 1 week removed from the much anticipated TPM 22, or Trans-Pacific Maritime Conference, that was out in Long Beach. For those of you that don't know or aren't familiar, that's one of the biggest supply chain or international logistics conferences that we have each year, and everybody's certainly been looking forward to this one because it's been a couple years since we'd been together. Don, it looks like you survived. How was the event for you?
Yeah, I did. It was great. I think it was interesting because I think going into it, I might have had some thoughts, and I was very interested to see how those perceptions might have been realities when I was there. And I thought it was a great event. I mean, overall, I think that the JOC did a great job. I would say it exceeded my expectations. And I think it's going to be an even better event next year. But this year was terrific.
Well, that's awesome. I kind of felt the same way. For those of you that have been listening, we had a couple of shows that was leading up to TPM. We had Mark Ciccone on from the JOC, who was very influential in creating the agenda, and I think he did a great job of assembling some incredible speakers and great breakouts. And then we also had the Crocs team on the week before TPM, talking about their thoughts about what it's been like to operate in this environment. And Mary actually took a center stage role as well at TPM, and I thought she did an incredible job there, just like she did on our podcast. But let me set this up. One of the things that you and I talked about today is maybe it would be fun on the show to just give our reaction, kind of do a TPM reaction show. Maybe some of the things that we thought were interesting, maybe a few things that we think are worthy of debate. But let me just kind of set this up from the way Peter and the team created the premise for the environment around relationships mattering. Talking about how complex the environment was, that there's going to be all different stakeholders that have the ability to come together and kind of talk about, what do we do about the current situation? And there was a bit of an undertone of kind of distrust and misunderstanding. Freight rates are at all-time highs. There's congestion and persistent issues. Reliability and service are at all-time lows. But there was this idea that everybody kind of needs everybody else. This is a supply chain, and it's almost like a relay race where we all kind of rely on each other to be successful. And the challenge is could this event, because it was in person, we've been virtual for the last couple of years, because it was in person, the challenge was, could some of those relationships be rebuilt, or could there be some common ground that was found? And I'm just curious, at the end of the day, one of the big questions that people walked away from it is do relationships really matter? And was this a chance to start to rebuild or try and understand someone else's perspective? And I'd love to hear how that hit or resonate with you.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting topic because I think going into TPM, I thought that, I was hearing a lot of things. I was hearing that people were dropping out, that people weren't going to come from Europe, just local contingents, and there was going to be less events. And it felt like there could be combative because people are so frustrated with what's happening today. And so there's some concern that was like, oh, is this going to be like a watered down version of TPM? I'm delighted to say that it wasn't that at all, that it was actually quite the contrary. It was a very well attended event. You saw people from Asia and Europe participating in this event. So I think from that standpoint, there was an opportunity to have a dialogue and engagement with the right level of stakeholder, which, again, going into it, there was some concern that it just felt a little unclear who exactly was going to be there and if there was going to be some missing pieces in order to have some of those dialogues. But that, I would say, again, proven wrong. So given that you had the right stakeholders there, I felt like there was a great opportunity for people to really collaborate and listen. And I think the fact that you had the right people and you could put them in a room together and say like, hey, maybe things didn't work out the way I wanted to. It's not exactly my fault or your fault, but let's talk about what we can do about that and come up with solutions. I think there were some meetings where people had those discussions. I think there were a lot of things that were flagged that are potential concerns going forward. But I think, coming away from there, I think, first of all, that question of do relationships matter? They absolutely matter. And I think that you should have some perspective of what to look for going forward, because I think there's a number of things that I take away that when I look to the future are things you have to keep your eye on that'll give you an indication of what's going to happen.
Yeah, I agree. I think the JOC did a great job. Credit to them for essentially not kind of panicking coming out of the holidays. I mean, there was a point where I think COVID cases were spiking, and I'm sure people were wondering, are we going to do this or are we not going to do this? But credit to them for putting on a safe event. Everybody, of course, was rapid tested. There were masks that were worn, in indoor locations, and so credit to them for first of all, doing it safely and making people feel comfortable. There were plenty of also outdoor spaces. We had unbelievable weather, which was nice as well. So there were plenty of outdoor spaces as well for people to have meetings. But I thought it was a really good mix, to your point. Well attended from the BCO perspective, from the carrier perspective. NVOs, man, they showed up in droves. It was great to see some of the major global NVOs as well as the technology providers. TPM Tech was on the front side of TPM. They did that for the first time. We had some members of our team and some colleagues go out. You and I weren't there for that, but we heard great things from it. But there were a lot that stayed over for TPM. And so it was really cool to see a lot of the different technology providers and the investment that's going into the supply chain. But I thought it was a really balanced event. It was great how they pulled in folks from the terminals, from ports, from government officials. I mean, really, I thought they covered it well. And I agree. I think the discussion was really good. Certainly a lot of great side meetings and discussions as well that happened. And I think TPM is always a good balance between, obviously there's a business and professional reason for being there. But then there's it's really hard to explain the relationship side of it's just nice sometimes to have casual conversations. There's still a business undertone to them, but to be away from a venue, be away from an office, and be talking about the business casually was really nice as well. So I felt like the discussions were meaningful and good. Now, I do think there are certainly still some hurt feelings out there and some fences that need to be mended because, as you said, the environment probably isn't getting better anytime soon. And that's one of the things that I was kind of thinking about. Part of preparing for this podcast was to try and report out some of the insights or things that were learned. I kind of put my former, shipper hat on when my company would invest in me, just like our company's invested in us to go out and spend a week. It's time away from the office. It costs money, but there's this learning component and influence component of what do I now do with this information and how do I apply it to my business or how do I educate my colleagues? And I was wondering, what would those notes look like if I was coming back to my organization to share with them, here's all the things I learned, or here's what the path forward is, because I'm sure they're all waiting. They're hoping that I came back with some amazing, right, insights and answers that, hey, look, this whole supply chain thing is going to be fixed right away. But the reality is, I think there were actually more insights for me that leads to, unfortunately, continued volatility, most likely, than a quick resolution to the issues we've been facing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you could point either direction. And I think at some point we'll unpack, like, what are the factors leading to things to continue and what are factors that point to things are changing. But I think that one of the main takeaways for me is that, and just was really underlined, is that the industry has changed and you see this sort of evolution of the industry. And I think that by bringing people together, we've been doing things on Zoom or Teams or whatever your media is to connect. But there's just a different level of communication that happens when you're standing face to face with somebody. So you get a better sense of things. And I don't know exactly what's that called or the psychology behind it. But I think when you bring people together, it makes more of an impact in terms of how that conversation works. But having said that, I think that, again, getting into takeaways, I think the evolution in the industry just has to be something that every stakeholder has to recognize, because you look at, carriers are getting involved in things beyond ocean. So before it was just very territorial, the carriers own the ocean space and that was it. But you can see that's been changing. You can see terminals now getting involved in the supply chain with the acquisition of BDP. You can see the consolidation of NVOs and to some extent carriers continues. And shippers are doing different things. They're now getting involved in different spaces, whether they're chartering vessels or they're partnering with terminals to create visibility to where their inland containers are. It's pretty interesting to see how things have evolved, but I think this marks a point in time where you have to say, I can see things are changing in the industry, which amplifies that point that I probably can't continue to do things the same way that I did them. Or if I do, I'm going to be left behind and I'm just going to be reacting to what my competitors have been doing now for the past year or 6 months or quarter.
Yeah, no, I think those are really valuable takeaways and insights. I think a couple of the things for me is just a renewed appreciation for how complex this stuff is to solve. I mean, there are so many stakeholders, there are so many things that need to be focused on. And it's kind of human nature, right? I mean, you're focused on what you're responsible for or what you're incented to do. And so while I think there were a ton of amazing speakers and a lot of amazing breakouts, it tended to be focused on their area of expertise and what they could do to impact their part of the business. But the reality, it's more than that, right? I mean, it takes an entire group of people and it takes overlap and collaboration to actually solve some of these challenges. So, it might be nice or it might be fun, next year to have a crossover group where you've got multiple stakeholders. You've got somebody from a carrier, an NVO, a shipper, maybe a terminal, maybe a port drayman, somebody on the warehouse or logistics side, and, just challenge them to kind of go through some kind of exercise, right? And they could even, get together a month or two before their panel like people typically do. And it'd be great to just hear, like, in unison, somebody present out maybe an end-to-end or maybe a collaborative type of solution that we could all start to kind of maybe pin as a model to focus on. I'd like to see something like that. But at the end of the day, for me, if I'm reporting back, I don't think that these things resolve themselves anytime soon. In fact, there could be more potential issues on the horizon. I mean, we're seeing it now with geopolitical issues that extend this volatility that we've been in. No easy answer, no silver bullet. And I think from a shipper perspective, you're right. As difficult as things are, it is clear that there were shippers that spoke that said, I'm not going to allow this to happen to me or my organization. We're going to be proactive. We're going to do things different. We're going to be open-minded to change. We're going to embrace technology. And it was clear they articulated the ways that it's benefiting them. They talked about, again, how they were embracing relationships with their supply chain partners, certainly a degree of give and take. But it's clear that there are some shippers that have figured out a way to operate in this environment and still create some bit of competitive advantage within their supply chain. From a carrier perspective, it was clear there are multiple strategies for operating in this environment. You have some carriers that are certainly committed to the long-term, commitments with shippers. You have carriers that have ambitions of getting into additional logistics services in the supply chain. And you have some carriers that are being much more, in the moment and focused on the current market and more of a transactional approach. And it'll be curious to see like which one of these strategies ultimately prevail. And maybe they all prevail. It's just, how they want to see that. And then from a port congestion and inflationary pressure, labor market, all those unfortunately continue to just point to just continued disruption. And, so if I'm coming back as a shipper, I'm saying, hey, there were some things that I heard that we need to think about on our side. And it's going to take some intentional work, and it's going to take us being different and, being willing to change if we want to be successful in the future.
Man, I love some of those points you brought up there, Brian, because I think the JOC is looking for feedback, from what I understand, for TPM 23. So Peter already mentioned that. And I think that idea of having more solutions and having those panels like work outside of the event and actually presenting like, hey, we collaborated. This is our idea. This is something we think could work. And even if it was like piloted and tested, I mean, I think that's really cool. I think your other point there about carrier strategies, I think it's really important for shippers to recognize that, carriers don't all have the same strategy. That you see some, as you mentioned, more thinking more long term, some are more short term, whatever the case may be. I think you as a shipper need to understand where different carriers are operating and how can I operate in that space with them, because it could be an opportunity if you're thinking, I'm only thinking multi-year and long term and I'm talking to another carrier where it's out. Should you necessarily rule that out as an option to look at part of my portfolio should be short term? I think it's just important for shippers to have that awareness, because I think you can operate in different lanes there. But another takeaway I had that I thought was really interesting was there was quite a bit of talk about the decarbonization of the industry. This remains to be an important target. We know that the IMO 23 is coming. But I think it was interesting is something that Vincent Clerc had talked about, and that is that there's this need to have global regulatory action, because he spoke about that there's a risk that there may not be one unified approach. And if that happens, then the risk is the EU could develop their own rules. And if the EU develops their own rules, then North America develops their own rules. And then you just think about the complexity required. If there isn't one approach, then you might have these regional approaches. And these regional approaches just create complexities for all the stakeholders in the supply chain. And I think what's frustrating about that is, just from the outside looking in, is saying, we all want the same thing. We all want a carbon neutral environment. We want to work towards that. But if each region starts to develop their own rules, it just creates unnecessary complexity and could derail some of the efforts that we're seeing. Because, again, my sense is publicly carriers, shippers, different stakeholders are saying, yeah, we want to be a carbon neutral industry. But if the rules are different, it just makes it more complex than necessary.
Yeah. And the last thing that this industry needs, or the stakeholders need, is more complexity right on top of what they currently have. And I think that was one of the cool things. I think that for me, talking to people that I've, experienced this business with for many years, you could see it there. Even though they were exhausted and it's been a long 2 years, there's this sense of pride in terms of, what it really means to be a supply chain professional. There was this recognition that, hey, look, for so long, people have assumed that the supply chain just runs flawlessly and it's not challenging or difficult or complex and anyone can do it. So there was a sense of pride that they are supply chain professionals. It isn't easy work, but it's important work. So this idea of saying, if we do our job well, the impacts are far and wide, not just here in the U.S., but globally, the impact that the supply chain can have in a positive way on what we do. So it was really kind of cool to see that as well, that kind of comes through. And again, the neat thing is with this recognition, there's kind of positives and negatives that come with press and being in the headlines. One, obviously the expectations are extremely high at this point that says this thing's been going on for a while now. There are best practices and things that you could learn to apply. So I think there's an expectation that you find a way to kind of, work and manage through some of these things and mitigate some of the risks. But I talked about it earlier too, just this an unbelievable investment that's coming into the industry. And so I think that as a shipper and certainly as a carrier and any other stakeholders, I think you really have to take a look at some of this new emerging technology because, as you said, there are things that just constantly want to make things more complex. And I saw some pretty cool things out there that actually could streamline, could standardize, and make things easier if there's adoption to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most noticeable things is that TPM in 2019, I guess, versus TPM 2022 is a number of startups that you saw there in these technology companies. I mean, I don't think Four Kites and P44, I mean, they might have been a thing. I didn't really notice them at that time. But now it's very prevalent, actually. You can see that that they're a lot more active, but there's other, E2 Open and Pay Cargo. I mean, there's a lot more of these companies that, again, I didn't think Bloom was another one that maybe you didn't see them before, but it was more carriers, ports, NVOs, and maybe, Trade Shift and some of these others to a smaller extent. But I think this year there were a lot of interesting companies out there. And again, I think if you're a shipper and you're reporting back or even a carrier, it's probably worth diving into some of these things and learning what they do, how your customers are using them, or how you could use them in your own organization to leverage things and improve your own visibility or what other part of the supply chain you're looking to enhance. I think there's a ton of opportunity there.
Yeah. Yeah. No doubt.
So one thing I think, one of the questions I think is on top of mind for most people is like, okay, I went to TPM, what does the future hold? And I think you have like Jeremy Nixon who talked about like, there's no quick fix. Like this is not going to be returned to normal soon. Then there might be others who are pointing to other things, other signs and saying, there's reason that market demand might go down. I think what you look at going on in Ukraine and things like that. But I think it might be worth, talking on both sides of that equation to say, what are those factors? Because, I mean, not to give it away before the end, but I think what that points to is there's a lot of uncertainty, that it's hard to pin down exactly what's going to happen, which creates that value behind having a more robust supply chain and things you can plan and are predictable, given that it's unclear how things are going to happen. But if you think about, the market staying the same or market up, I mean, what struck you as, or what were the kind of things that you were hearing that would keep the market rolling along the same way it has been for the past year and a half, 2 years?
Yeah, I think it'd be fun to talk through it. I think one of the things that I heard the most is, or the question I got the most is, hey, Brian, you've been doing this for a while. When do you think the market will get back to normal? And I thought that was kind of funny. I mean, it's a funny term, normal. It's a relative term. And, for me, we kind of had a fun discussion about, well, what do you define as normal? For me, doing this for the past, 25, plus years, normal was severe overcapacity, unprofitable rates, carriers fighting for market share, and carriers trying to stay out of bankruptcy. Like that was normal. And if you're saying, when will we get back to that? My answer is probably never. Now, I could be proven wrong on that, but I can't see any scenario within the next, 10, 20 years where the carriers would allow themselves to kind of be put back in that kind of a position. Now, I had a counter argument, Brian, that says, hey, Brian, carriers are carriers, man. They'll go back to their old ways. I'm just not sure I believe it. So my definition of normal would be something that's more of equilibrium. I think carriers now are much smarter about how they deploy capacity and how they, can allow, more of a supply demand, match or equilibrium. I think normal probably is some degree of profitable, rates, probably not $20,000 and $30,000 spot rates, but something that would be viewed by the carriers as profitable and reinvestable in their business. Normal being maybe reliability getting back to something that was in the 80% range. I think we all thought that was okay at the time. And I think people would give anything to get back to 80% right now. And then this idea of just kind of, supply and demand being back to reasonable growth rates, GDP plus something. When do I think that's going to happen? It probably feels like it's going to be a couple of years because, as you said, I think volatility and uncertainty is just endless right now. I think that the congestion issue in the ports is going to take something significant to resolve quickly. And we can talk about what those things may or may not be. But unless something happens dramatic, that probably continues for some time. Unless something dramatically happens with demand, which very well could. And again, we can debate it. We know, and I've talked to a lot of the shippers out there, that there are still restocking efforts that are taking place and will take place for a period of time. And I think the majority of capacity that's available until new builds come on is deployed. So I don't think there's a whole lot of outlet valves or a whole lot of buffer or slack that's going to be added back in. So to me, that continues to point to a tightness. It continues to point to, probably, rates at elevated levels. And you just say, well, Brian, when the ships come in, you made the good point earlier that says, well, there's this impending regulation that could cause older ships to slow down, which absorbs capacity. Carriers, of course, can scrap ships. They haven't scrapped anything. And I guess if they wanted, I suppose they could even cancel some of the new orders if, somehow demand changes dramatically in the near term. But my point being is, you can see there are a number of factors you could point to that says this current environment at an elevated level stays for a period of time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think that there's enough things happening, and I think Lars Jensen talked a lot about pointing to some of those things that just says, uncertainty is a thing. Because again, the things you said, the backlog is an issue. The ports are congested. And he brought up the point, Lars did, that said, it was about a year ago that we had 40 ships docked outside of LA, and we're like, oh my God, this is a catastrophe. How can we have 40 ships backed up in LA? And then that number went up over 100 at some point and towards the end of last year. So, you saw things get progressively worse, and now that number's down. But the point being is that this congestion issue is still there, and it's going to take some time for that to sort itself out. Then you look at things like the IMO regulation. How is that going to impact things? We have this pending labor negotiation, which all signs are pointing to this being a very tough negotiation. And again, it's tough for the carriers because it's like the first time in history that they've made money. You can argue if it's too much money or not, but they're certainly doing well. And they just face a lot of cost headwind. You look at bunker costs. I'm sure this is very concerning. I think it's concerning for consumers at the pump, but for ocean carriers, it's a large component of their cost structure. So there's things out there which are, I think, making it very nerve-wracking for carriers. But the point being is that, there's things that are out there that we know of already that point to, it's hard to say that things are going to change. But the other thing that you said, Brian, is that, I see that in a lot of ways, the carrier mentality is still the same. They're doing things the same way they've done it for the past 10 years. I can't entirely judge that, but I think those are signs where, maybe it goes back to this, the way things were, that old normal, whatever that was. I tend to be in the camp of you that I think there's a new normal. I don't think you're going to ever see things return back quite the way they were. But what does that look like? I still think that's TBD. I don't think we can predict exactly what that's going to look like, because I think a lot of people are hoping for, like, okay, this $20,000 rate, that's not going to be around anymore. But then what is it? Is it 10? Which, when the rate hit 10, by the way, I was shocked. I was like, I can't believe there's a $10,000 rate. And then it virtually doubled, much less like a $6,000 rate, right? But those I had heard of, like, in unique circumstances happening. So what does that new rate level look like? Again, I think it's hard to say. So there's enough things out there which I think point to this is going to continue at least until the end of the year. But again, it's very difficult to predict.
But Don, let me put it to you this way. If you're a carrier, and you have been for a long time, your underlying cost, like I think people have either underestimated or not talked about this enough, the underlying cost of the carriers, the charter rates that people are locking into, the prices they're paying for these new fuel-efficient ships, the underlying cost to operate the vessel, to your point, with fuel, labor costs, what they're having to pay for equipment now. Everything is more expensive than it's ever been. So Let's start there. Then now there's a second piece where now you're engaging kind of shippers outside, at least some carriers outside of just the ocean component. So now you're getting deeper with shippers in terms of other logistics services. And, many carriers have already signed contracts at premium levels for the next 2 to 3 years. So in what scenario as a carrier would you decide that lowering rates makes sense?
Well, I think it's a question of if, let's just say hypothetically, and we should talk about like what's the environment that would cause this to happen, which I think
Sure.
there are some things which point to this possible. But if I'm a carrier, and let's just say for argument's sake, that I've agreed to a long-term rate of $10,000 and the market drops down to $5,000, the challenge you're going to run into is that, first of all, and you were on the shipper side, Brian, but the pressure you're going to face, like signing those checks for a $10,000 container, when your CFO knows that the market's at $5,000, and he's got to be thinking, that Bryan Most, why is he giving the store away? That guy is Santa Claus. He's just paying all this money away when I know the market rate's $5,000. Why isn't he leveraging that? So you're going to be under a lot of pressure. And the temptation for you to go to your carrier and say, okay, look, the rate's $5,000 now. You know it, I know it. Can't we come to some sort of renegotiation? Can't we restructure this thing? And the risk is if you walk away, right, and you say, okay, forget it, I'm walking away. Okay, you've burned a bridge with the carrier. The question is, can you afford to do that? Do you have enough options to deal with that? And the second is, do you believe that the carrier is going to litigate that contract and pull you into some sort of lawsuit? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think when there's this margin, and let's face it, in the past shipping industry, that margin could have been $200 and people would leave you tomorrow. And it was always frustrating to say, like, come on, man, that's $200. Now, okay, the margins are a lot different. And I think this is troubling for shippers, is that they see the rates are all over the place for different durations. But the question is, how are you going to respond when you see that there's this change in rate? Because you as a shipper are going to be the one who's under pressure. And are the carriers going to say, like, you know what? $5,000, I'm actually still making money. So why don't I think more longer term with Brian? Because we didn't know the rate was going to change or there was going to be this $5,000 gap. So shouldn't we say, hey, it's still profitable, and now we save Brian and we developed a partnership with his business? I don't know if that would happen, but I could possibly paint that scenario. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, this is why what we've been talking about for a while is if you're pinning your entire strategy on what rates are going to be, it's probably not a holistic way of looking at this thing, right? This idea of saying that I'm going to try and predict rates, which is probably near impossible for anybody, versus saying I'm going to take this more end-to-end look and I'm going to more focus on reliability and performance and things of that nature. So I can create this blend of cost where if any one component, dramatically goes up or down, I'm not, my entire strategy is not thrown off, and I'm not put in a position where I have to have a discussion with a carrier as to do I end our relationship, at this point because I can't comply or I don't agree with, the contract that we both signed 6 months ago. I just think that that's, not the way to do long-term strategic types of business. But to your point, you could paint the scenario that says it will absolutely probably happen. It could happen if that was the case. But again, my caution or the advice we've been given to shippers is to say, you got to be smart. You've got to look at your allocations as portfolios. You've got to manage your risk. Maybe there's a portion of your business that is exposed, right, to this downside, but make sure it's a portion that you can live with. Because Don, in your scenario, if that happens, my hope would be is that maybe that is 10, 20, or 30% of my business, and I have, 80, 60 or 70% that's, that I have flexibility within the market, and I can offset it, and I'm still getting extremely high levels of service, even though I'm paying a premium for it. And maybe I'm using that as a trade down from air freight, or I'm using that as my most important products that I drive high margins. Like, who knows? But there are a number of ways that you could do that in that scenario. But I think it's fun to think about, okay, to me, the case is compelling for rates in the market to stay high. But it is fun to think about the other side where you say, hey, this inflation, whatever that term they used early on, transient, it doesn't feel transient anymore, right? So if you say inflation is going to be persistent, today gas prices are as high as they've ever been in this country on average. So you and I both know that that starts to have an impact. You heard people talk at TPM about potentially looking at, moving sourcing, this idea of near sourcing. Maybe it's not, to the US, but it could be across the border in Mexico or Canada. You could say that as COVID continues to decline, there's this move, this continued move from goods to services. And, you could say that there are a number of things that are happening that could have a dramatic impact in a short period of time on demand. And if that happens, it could create this environment where the carriers do have to decide how they are deploying capacity. Because if that breather or that break in demand happens where the restocking effort is not needed, those orders get canceled, all of a sudden port congestion gets cleaned up. So you get 10% of additional capacity put back into the market and you got new ships coming on. I don't know. Like that could be a scenario that could play out. And then I think your discussion between a shipper and a carrier could absolutely happen because of those contracts that they've currently signed at elevated premiums. Do you think that's a reasonable scenario?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I'm not good at predicting things because I'm generally wrong. But there's a few things that I like to look at and unpeel. And I think the first thing I'd like to mention is that when we think about like, hey, all right, could things go the other way? I think the financial markets seem to be giving some indication that maybe they're not so confident that the carrier returns are going to continue. And you look at the carrier PE ratios, and it was Morgan Stanley at TPM that was saying, well, Maersk's PE ratio is 3.8 and Kuehne+Nagel's is 18.4. So what does that suggest? That suggests that NVO is asset light, is going to continue to find ways to make money, but they're not so confident about the carriers. And you could judge that. The financial markets don't always get it right. But I think there's some thought around like, maybe I'm not so confident that these types of returns are going to continue. I think you look at something else that carriers are clearly under pressure. I mean, you look at what Biden said during the State of the Union. And again, you can argue whether they're pointing the finger in the right place. But I mean, it was stated even before the State of the Union that there was going to be this task force between the Department of Justice and the FMC to have this investigation into carriers. And there's all this finger pointing at carriers to say, hey, look at how much money these guys are making. It seems excessive. It seems like these rates have gotten out of control. We need to do something. Now, I feel a little bit bad being a carrier guy because it's like the first time in history that they're making this kind of money. Well, any money, let alone this kind of money. And you can argue that this is like 10 years worth of earnings or something. But from a carrier perspective, I mean, I think it's good that carriers make money. Again, is it 20 billion too much money? I mean, again, we can debate that. But I think that it feels like the minute that they have some success and wins, there's this pressure to say that, well, financial markets don't have a lot of confidence. I got governments pointing to me and saying, hey, these guys need to be looked at. And then the thing you talked about was inflation. And inflation has been a real thing. I think the whole Ukraine situation has exacerbated this problem that now fuel prices were going up and now they really kind of are spiking. And what is the effect there? Well, there's two effects that I think are concerning. The one is the carrier effect, that is their costs start going up higher. And how do they exactly manage this? Because they're under all this pressure from regulators to say, hey, your rates better not go up higher. But, they want to be compensated for fuel. But if I'm now sticking you with another $300 per TEU increase and you're like, but Don, my rate's $10,000. Like, why do you need to make another $300-$600 on it? Might feel a little bit wrong. But I think the more concerning impact is that the consumer demand. And to your point, to say like, hey, listen, when these fuel prices go up, there's just this erosion of your dollar on what you can spend it on, discretionary spending. And I think there's some other things to point to. Is COVID over? We're shedding our masks now. People are going back to the office. Well, if I go back to the office, I'm probably going to drive there. I'm going to take some sort of public transportation. Well, that cost just went up. And so not only did the fact that just returning to the office, my cost went up, but now it's even more expensive than it was, 2-3 years ago. So because, again, as you say, the height of fuel prices, we're in this unprecedented category. So what kind of effect does that have on demand? And I think you could argue and say, well, it's common sense would say there's going to be some impact on demand. The Fed is talking about increasing interest rates, and they're concerned about inflation. So you have all these cost factors which point to a reduction in demand. Now, is that demand like some dropping like a stone, some 10% reduction in consumption? Or is it more of like a softer landing? Again, we could speculate, probably be wrong. But I think you could look at either side of the equation and say, well, there's things that make me think, this could really happen.
Yeah. Well, hey, look, either way, I think that to your point, no one predicts and no one can know, but and our listeners are probably like, well, hey, look, you didn't really give us any answers. You actually made it harder. Hopefully they think we made two good, compelling cases for what could happen. But I think, Don, the one thing, though, we have been saying, and I think we're 30 podcasts or so in at this point, is that, being proactive, controlling what you can control, having a balanced portfolio, managing risk, like all these things that we've been talking about still hold true. So while we don't know exactly which one of these scenarios plays out, this idea of managing your supply chain in a much different way, as you kind of spoke about at the beginning, I think it's got to be the name of the game. You got to leave yourself options, whether it's one way or the other. There's got to be some flexibility and resilience that's built in. So you have the ability to turn left or right when it's time to do that. But either way, you always have some degree or some way of moving product. And again, I think those are the companies that have started to embrace that are the ones that are winning today. So I don't know. It'll be fun to see how this thing turns out, but I would still advocate for those things that we actually started talking about, over a year ago, because I think that's probably an environment we stay in for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, Brian. I mean, I think, hopefully none of our listeners are frustrated, be like, these guys, they're just saying all this stuff. But I think it's the reality. I mean, you could talk yourself into either one of these scenarios. And I think the point that you raise is that, like, look, you just need a diversified strategy because there's so much uncertainty out there. And I would say, like, if you believe Lars Jensen is one of the thought leaders in this space, just listen to Lars, talk to Lars. He'll give you a lot of different data points, more so in depth than what we've provided. But there's a lot, or you can talk to some other people too. But my point is that there's a lot of different data points you can draw from. You could write whatever story you want to say this is going to be what's happening for the next 5 years, or this is going to change and fall flat on its face. I don't think you know, but I think you have a responsibility in this industry to say, I have to take a different approach because I don't know. And if I'm going to sit here and wait, right, I'm going to take that latter position and say, okay, demand's going to shift. Things are going to open up and I'm just going to sit in my chair and wait. You could be waiting for a very long time and it could be a very expensive waiting period for you to figure out what's happening. I mean, I think you have to take a position and you have to say, okay, trying to manage risk here. Because the other thing is if you create, let's say, a more longer term fixed lane corridor, that's going to pay dividends for years because what's on the other side? Well, who knows what's on the other side? Now you have this labor disruption. Well, now it's like, oh, well, this caused problems for me. Boy, I wish I had that predictable lane. So I totally agree. I think that you have to have different scenarios because just having one approach is probably not going to work with all these things that are happening in the market.
Very, very well said. Well, Don, as we wrap up, one thing you didn't ask about was, this nice shirt I have on. I thought you might comment how nice the color is and maybe why I was wearing such a colorful shirt today.
What I mean, I was wondering that, Brian, but I don't know. It's a podcast, so a lot of people listen. They don't see it, so I didn't want to make those listeners upset. But now that you kind of poked the bear, Brian, what's up, man? That's a very good-looking pink shirt you got on today. What's the rationale behind that?
Well, the cool thing is that we're also we're recording this on International Women's Day. So there's 3 women that are really important in my life, but 2 of them are my daughters. And I told them that I was doing a podcast this morning and said, hey, go pick Dad's shirt out today for the podcast. And so this is the shirt that my daughters picked. But in all seriousness, I think it's worth kind of giving a shout out to those unbelievable, women in our lives and our colleagues, and just to thank them for how they've impacted our lives and, personally and professionally helped us become the the people we are today. But I'm certainly honored, to work with the women that we do today at the New York Shipping Exchange, and of course all of the females that I've worked with in my career. But just a quick happy International Women's Day, and thank you to all those who have poured into me and us over a long period of time.
Yeah, I think that's such a great shout out, Brian, because I mean, I've been in this industry a long time, and I think, I've heard more than one woman say to me that this is a tough industry for women, that it seems to be a very male dominated industry. Now, thank God that's changing. And I think that we're finally getting some diversity. And I think that's been accelerating over the past few years. But I think it's been tough. And I think it's a great time to recognize that and recognize how we've made progress. Mission is not accomplished at all, but we continue to work towards that. And that's really exciting. So great call out, and just a big thank you from myself that we appreciate all of your efforts, because it's really been tremendous, and let's keep it going, because we need the support of and inclusion of all different types of demographics. But today we're recognizing International Women's Day, and it's an important day. So awesome shout out.
Very good.
Well, great. Well, great show, Brian. Great talking, debating, some great thoughts there. And for our listeners, don't forget, rate us, review us, give us our feedback. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll hear you next time. So thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.